lot to think about in our daily lives. We have work to do, schedules that keep us constantly on the move, and when we get a break, we relax. We have a lot of stuff to think about, and most of it is about ourselves. We spend so much time consumed with our own stuff that we miss opportunities to serve others. These opportunities constantly surround us, but we miss them because they don't include our stuff. But what if God has bigger and better plans for our lives? In Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, we are told, "Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others." God is choosing us, even though we are concerned with our own interests. God is calling us and molding us alongside others. So then we begin to look toward the interests of others, to look for those opportunities to serve. Then God sends us out into the community, outside the walls of the church building. We are sent to serve the financially poor, the emotionally broken, the mentally exhausted, and the spiritually lost. We are sent to shine God's light of hope and to share our time, gifts, resources, stories, and our very selves to serve the community. God is calling us to look beyond ourselves and to live like we are chosen to serve.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that. For those of you who have never been up there, there are a lot of buttons, a lot of dials, a lot of things going on. Ryan does a great job for us, and we do appreciate all he does. So here we are again. We continue to talk about being chosen to serve, and all of us should be excited about this prospect because none other than God himself has chose us to serve him and to serve this world that we live in. And we're beginning this series with a look at how can we look beyond ourselves. Last week I talked a little bit about the movie Pay It Forward. Did anyone get a chance to check that movie out last week? Okay, one person lie, just to make me feel good. I still encourage you to check that movie out. It is a very good, very inspirational movie, and it teaches us something that we need to hear, and that is that when we reach out and help others in our immediate sphere of influence, when we reach out and help lift them up, that enables them to go out and do likewise. And it just, a geometric progression, I believe, was what I was told that is called. And before we know it, the kingdom of God is spreading. So last week we took a look at that movie and we began to understand that we need to lift our heads from our immediate little world and start to look up. And when we start to look up, the first thing we begin to see are those that are around us. We begin to recognize that some of those that are around us are in need. And not necessarily in need of a bite to eat or $5 for gas. But there are people around us who are in need of help, a leg up, not a hand out. And when we begin to recognize that need and respond to that need, we empower those people, as I just described. But as we continue to lift our head and look out even further, when we begin to look at our community, when we begin to look at our nation, we begin to see more need, different need. In the scripture that we used last week, looking at Philippians chapter 2, that verse that we saw in this video just now, look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. For me, that was at the core of that particular passage that we looked at. But you know what? That's a pretty vague statement. What does it mean to look at the interests of others? What was Paul talking about? So to get some more detail behind that, to get some more information about what Paul might have been talking about, this week we're going to look at the book of Hebrews. Now we're not sure who wrote this book. For some time it was attributed to Paul, but even as early as the 2nd, 3rd century, people started to say, no, it probably wasn't Paul. The language is too elaborate. It wasn't written as a letter to a specific congregation. There are a number of factors that people just started to say, no, this probably wasn't Paul. Well, who was it? We don't know. But we're going to call the writer of this book the preacher. Because throughout most of this book, that's what this author is doing. He is preaching. He is telling the good news of Jesus Christ. He is describing who Jesus Christ is. And we have to remember that when this book was written, odds are the Gospels had not been written yet. The story of Jesus Christ from, in some cases, from birth all the way through the resurrection had not been put down on paper to be shared with people. So this book was written along with Paul's letters to try to help people understand what was this Jesus event and why do I care? Why should it matter to me? So this writer, this preacher, wrote this sermon to describe who Christ is. But then in the last chapter, in chapter 13 of the book of Hebrews, he kind of turns focus a little bit. There's even been debate that maybe this was a separate writing that was kind of conjoined with the writing of Hebrews, but I don't think so. I think this preacher turned to his congregation and began to instruct them on what it means to be a follower of this Jesus that he had just described. So I think a lot of us are in that same spot. We're beginning to understand a little bit about who Jesus is. We're beginning to understand a little bit about why it matters to me. And now we're starting to look at how do I respond to this. So as we look at this 13th chapter of Hebrews, we're going to take a look at some verse by verse, because in these first 6 verses of this chapter, the preacher tries to help us answer that question. So looking at the first two sentences here. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. You know, and I read this text, and I think about this text, and I think about us in this congregation. And I think we're doing pretty well with these first 2 sentences here. Certainly, we show mutual love to each other. We look after each other, and we do pretty well with that. To know that James and Laura's in the hospital with an emergency of appendectomy, nice word, and to reach out to that family to offer them assistance and aid and comfort as they work through this with the new child and everything else that's going on in their life. That's like, yeah, it's what we do. And there are countless other stories about each of us reaching out to the other, to lift up, to comfort, to help. That's what we do. So we're pretty good with that. Do not neglect hospitality to strangers. I think we're doing quite well with that as well. People come into this congregation, they wander in off the street looking for something, looking for relief, looking for guidance. And I watch you embrace those people as they come in. I watch you greet them with genuine sincerity that we are glad you are here. I observe that all the time, and I think we do a really good job with that. But you know, as we lift our eyes from our immediate surroundings and start to look out, this next part has me a little concerned. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. I don't live under a rock, and I don't think any of us do. We all have televisions? Yes. We all have access to news. We have access to information more so than any other time in our history, in the history of the world. On our little phones, we can type in a few little commands and get information on just about anything we didn't want to know. So that being said, as I encountered this part of this text, talking about prisons, I remembered something I had heard, so I used my little phone and typed in some commands and came up with some statistics. Let's take a look at that first slide there, Ryan. This shocked me. This is the rates of incarceration. This is a number of people per 100,000 that are incarcerated in various countries around the world. And I don't know what to make of that first line. We're number one. We incarcerate 716 people for every 100,000 people who live in this great nation of ours. Our next closest competitor is the great nation Rwanda, rife with civil war. Right after that, Russia, with just little over half as many incarcerated people as we have. Now I'm confused. I love this country. I love this nation. I love everything that this nation offers its people, the opportunities, the freedom to gather as God's people and worship freely. I love all of this. But these numbers confuse me. And you can look and you can find similar graphs and similar charts and similar sets of numbers. And they may vary a little bit, but every one I have found show this. Back up, Ryan. Every one that I have found show that we lead the world in incarcerated people. And that begs the question, are Americans just criminals? Are we all criminals? Or do we just breed criminals better than any other nation in the world? I don't believe that. I believe there's something else maybe going on below this. So on this next slide, some more statistics. This is a timeline graph of how we're doing with incarceration. And you'll notice around 1980, look at that jump that happens. We're plodding along, we're at about 500,000 people in prison. In 1980, it explodes. So one might ask, what happened in 1980? Right about that time, we announced that we were undertaking a war. We were entering into a war. Our nation decided it was best for us to conduct a war on drugs. I know many of you are educators. I know many of you are involved in school systems. And I would have to ask, has that war worked? Have drugs been eradicated from our schools? Then the next question is, why do we have probably 3 million people locked up, the majority of which are locked up for drugs? I ask these questions of our nation. I ask these questions of our society. Now I'm asking the question of you as a people of God. Where are we? What are we doing? Nobody, I would say mostly nobody that I've ever heard of, no child I've ever talked to when asked, what do you want to be when you grow up, would respond, I want to be a drug addict. I want to be a drug dealer. Maybe my world is small and I don't get out much, but I'm pretty sure most children would not respond that way. They want to be firemen, they want to be doctors and lawyers. So how does one get from a child who wants to be a doctor to one who is incarcerated? And where are the people in between? This last graph is the number of children with a parent in jail or prison. We can see that in 1980 that number was approximately 500,000, and now it's 2.5 million. 2.5 million kids have a parent who is in prison or jail. And again, I'm sure you can find statistics that will show a variation to this, but I can almost guarantee that the number that you find, even if it is more favorable, will still be appalling. We're expecting children to grow up, to become people who know that they are chosen to serve, to become people who support each other, to become people who recognize that they are children of God, while one of their parents or both of their parents are in jail or prison. I struggled with preparation for this sermon because it's hard information for us to take in. But that's what happens when we begin to look up, when we begin to look out, when we begin to see those who are immediately around us, and when we look beyond those who are immediately around us. I'm reminded of a story in the Gospel of John, 5th chapter, where Jesus is in Jerusalem, and he passes by a pool that's near the Sheep's Gate. You guys, some of you may remember this story. In that pool, every now and then, the angels would trouble the waters. And when the waters were troubled, if one were placed in those waters, one could find healing. And at this pool was a man who had been there for 38 years. For 38 years, society had walked by him. And you got to believe that somebody fed him. Somebody replaced his clothes for him. Somebody covered him in the worst of storms. Somebody helped him live, survive. But when Jesus passed him, he noticed him sitting there and asked, inquired, wanted to know why he was there. And the man explained that for 38 years he had been there, and every time the water is troubled, there is no one to help him get to it. And every time he tries, someone gets there before him. So for 38 years he suffered. So Jesus told the man that he was healed, to get up and take his mat. And then Jesus did not stop there. He went to the people who allowed this to continue for so long and began to teach. Jesus looked out from his small little place, and he saw a world. God saw there were things in this world that were not acceptable. So God sent his only Son to us to help us understand these things should not be acceptable to us either. To wake us up, to move us, to spur us to action, to empower and encourage us to reach out to those who are by the pool but cannot get there. So why don't we? Where are we? What are we doing to change these statistics? I can speak for me. I can speak that for most of my life, my world was here. For most of my life, my goal was to gather in resources, to gather in family, to gather in friends, to gather in financial resources, to build my walls of protection from this world that is so ugly. That's what I do. That's what I have done. But you know what? Those walls are not tall enough for me. They're not tall enough to drown out the noise of the suffering that is happening outside of them. So where are we? As we read further in the book of Hebrews, he says, let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed kept undefiled. For God will judge fornicators and adulterers. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. God has told us that God will never leave us, will never forsake us. God is with us. So the fear that drives my need to build these walls of security through my friends, through my family, through my financial resources, through whatever means I use to build these walls of security is unfounded. That fear should not exist because I believe in God. I believe in the love that God has for me. So why do I fear anything? And in fact, the preacher goes on to say, so we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can anyone do to me? So these walls that I have built are useless. They do nothing but assuage my own fear, my own unfounded fear, and separate me from those who need, those who suffer, those I am able to help. And I can't stand up here and offer solutions to any of these problems. Even I'm not that bold and audacious. I cannot stand here and tell you I know how to fix these problems. I know how to help these people. Because I don't. I have just enough information to make me dangerous. I have just enough information to recognize that there is a problem out there. And this is just a small sampling of the people who are suffering in our nation and in our world. But what I do know is that with all of us together, we can find those answers. We can reach those solutions. We can act. We can respond. I do know that as we gather in discipleship groups, as we form those bonds, as we grow together by learning what God has told us, by learning how to listen to God, by learning how to be in relationships with each other, by learning how to worship God as God is meant to be worshiped, we can grow. And in those groups, we can begin to explore what it is that we have. What are these gifts that God has given me, and how can I use them? What are these resources that God has entrusted me with? How can I be a good steward of them? And how can I share with others why I do this? We can grow into these things. We can become powerful people to share the message of the good news of Jesus Christ, to help lift people up so that they are able to share this message as well. So, that's all I can offer. I encourage you to join in community, to join with each other, to talk about these problems, to talk to God, to listen to God, to respond to God's world that is hurting because you have been chosen to serve by none other than God. And in order to serve, we have to lift our eyes. We have to look out into the world and see where we are needed. So please join me. Amen.